Good morning, everyone. My name is Jen Lammy, and I manage the Sustainable Seafood Initiative at the Good Food Institute. Today, I wanted to kind of start with a couple of housekeeping notes. First of all, we're going to record this webinar so that you can go back and watch it later. And for folks that were not able to join, they can go back and watch as well. So I'll hit record just in a moment. If you put comments in the chat area in this webinar, those will be visible to everyone on the call. And if you would like to put your questions in the Q&A area, we'll get to those more towards the end. I am going to go ahead and, oh, we are already recording. Excellent. All right, so thank you everyone for joining. I'm really excited to be doing this session today. This is part of our seafood webinar and informal mixer series, SWIM. And today we're going to be talking about connections between the seaweed or macroalgae space and alternative proteins. So we are going to start with this panel, and then we are going to head over to Meet Away for anyone who wants to join after this hour for some informal networking. So if you're interested in joining that and you didn't sign up yet, there is a sign up link in your confirmation email from this webinar, and I will also drop that sign up link into the chat here once we get started. And we will stop this session about 5 minutes before the hour, just so that folks who want to join that can have a couple minutes to take a break before coming back to the computer. As I mentioned, if you want to ask our panelists a question, please go ahead and use the Q&A function, and we will kind of collect the questions from there at the end and make sure that we answer as many as possible in the last 10 to 15 minutes. And hopefully we'll be able to kind of cover all of your burning questions before the end of this session. And then I have a note on this slide that if you would like to sign up for our quarterly newsletter, Turning the Tide, you should definitely do that. We have events in there, but also sort of news on the industry and research, policy updates, really everything alternative seafood in one space. So highly recommend signing up for that. And there will be a link for that. It's both on the slide right now, but also if you get your confirmation email after the webinar, you'll see a link in there. Just wanted to make one final note that GFI is 100% supported by philanthropy, so we rely on grants and gifts to really make events like this happen. So if anyone in our audience right now is part of our family of generous supporters, just wanted to say a quick thank you. So quick introduction to this conversation before I let the panelists kind of introduce themselves. This conversation was really born out of this emerging parallel trends where both there's a lot of excitement and enthusiasm about sustainable seaweed cultivation and a lot of growth in the alternative protein industry. So there's this, growing global call for more seaweed production and this growing global market for alternative protein, and where can we connect those together? So while there are certainly some geographies where seaweed is already really central to the plate, there are also areas, including the US, where that's not very common. So instead, what if we use macroalgae as an ingredient in alternative proteins that consumers are already enjoying? And especially in the case of alternative seafood, where we can, kind of achieve this very elegant solution of feeding people directly what they kind of get as the nutritional profile through fish, typically in their diet. So I am really thrilled to have this group of panelists with us today to kind of share their thoughts on why sustainable seaweed is important, and also on sort of how we can better coordinate between these two parallel growing industries to really allow for strong and sustainable growth. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen right now so that you can see our panelists. And I am going to start by giving them each probably about 1 to 2 minutes to introduce themselves. So we'll just go in the order of my screen, and I'll start with you, Michelle.
Wonderful. Good morning, everyone. I'm Michelle Wolf, co-founder of New Wave Foods. We are the application of seaweed-derived ingredients, as we are the makers of plant-based, delicious shrimp. And my background is in material science, but my passion has always lied in wanting to bring forward sustainable food solutions to consumers. The company was founded about 5 years ago when Beyond Meat and Impossible Foods were starting to gain a lot of traction within the market, but no one was looking at seafood. So we saw an incredible opportunity to use a plant-based approach to address issues in our seafood supply chains. We chose shrimp because it is the most consumed seafood in the United States. It's about a $9 billion market and continues to grow about 10% year over year. Unfortunately, though, shrimp have a lot of issues with environmental and sustainability issues, human rights, and fraud issues within the industry. And our answer to these problems was to provide a delicious alternative to that through a plant-based shrimp. We designed the product so it could be a one-for-one swap for ocean shrimp within any recipe with the same taste, texture, and versatility. And I'm really excited to talk to you guys today about how we use seaweed-derived ingredients to get some of those tastes and textures, and how driving demand for products like ours can incentivize seaweed cultivation up the supply chain.
Great, thank you. Dr. Reddy, over to you. I think you're muted.
Hello, good morning.
There you go.
We are working on macroalgae and working with a company which formed a consortium of people to promote the seaweed sector in India. And the primary objective of our consortium is to promote seaweed cultivation to reverse the climate change and also help the the community development and livelihood promotion of the people living in the coastal areas. So I have been working on seaweeds for more than 30 years with various organizations. So our interest is to make sustainable cultivation technologies, which has a great demand in India. One of the biggest challenges what we face and what Indian seaweed industry facing today is the shortage of raw material. So we are focusing on development of sustainable cultivation technologies for producing raw materials, and simultaneously we are also working on the downstream process of biomass what we produce it. So we have got proof of concept established for downstream process in the biorefinery model, and some of the important leads what are taking place in the world, we are very conscious about it. And one of the lead what we would like to capture is the alternative proteins. So I think there are very interesting points have been raised. Maybe in the course of time we will share what strategy we need to do to meet this alternative protein. I think theme is concerned. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Beth.
Hi, thank you for having this webinar, and thank you to GFI for bringing this community together. My name is Beth, and I am the CEO and co-founder of Trophic. We are developing a process to extract proteins from seaweeds. We believe seaweeds are the most sustainable and scalable source of protein on the planet, and that the ocean is the Earth's biggest and best bioreactor for making protein. Thanks to a grant from GFI, we were able to do some proof of concept work starting in 2019 to extract protein from sustainably harvested ocean farmed red seaweeds. And we're making a lot of progress on that, and I'm excited to tell you about the work we're doing on that. In addition to that work, we're also working higher up the supply chain on large scale open ocean farming. With the support of the Department of Energy, who's interested in seaweed for biofuels, we're developing and engineering robust, low cost, and low cost structures for offshore farming of seaweeds that will help us achieve the scale and the cost points that we need for seaweed protein to be competitive with a lot of the other proteins that are commonly used in plant-based meat and seafood. So I'm looking forward to answering your questions today.
Thank you. On to you, Charlie.
Good morning, everyone. Hello from Oban on the west coast of Scotland, where I'm based. I'm the co-founder and CTO of Oceanium. I'm a biochemist by background. I've spent my entire working life developing new products from marine biomass, everything from seaweed to starfish and lots of things in between. Oceanium started 2.5 years ago when I met my co-founder, Karen. She wanted to make packaging from seaweed, and we really quickly realized that that wouldn't work. We needed to use the whole plant and make a range of products. So we now have developed a biorefinery technology to take whole farmed seaweed and make a range of products, which include protein and fiber for food, packaging material, a biodegradable packaging material, and a couple of nutraceutical polysaccharides. And we're doing this through scale steps at the moment. So it's in development, moving up to 25-ton processing scale right now, and working closely in partnership with farmers to make sure we've got sustainable supply and that we can scale this industry, which is really important. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Dr. Levine.
Good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to join the webinar. I'm a professor at the University of Southern Maine, but I'm also the president and board chair of the Algae Foundation. I've been involved with algae since 1975, and in the 90s owned the largest seaweed farm in US history off the coast of Maine and Canada. But I'm here today also in terms of the Algae Foundation. We're dedicated to all things algal-based education and job training. We've reached 96,000 students in all 50 states and 45 countries. So I've farmed seaweeds around the world, whether they were eucumoids or gracilaria or nori. So most of the commercial reds I've farmed somewhere in the world, and happy to answer any questions.
Wonderful, thank you. And last but not least, let's turn it over to Paul.
Hi, and thanks for the invitation to be here. My name is Paul O'Connor. About 6 years ago, I set up a company called This Is Seaweed, initially focusing on consumer products, but now we've shifted our focus to food ingredients companies, feed companies, and pet food companies. To back this up, we have a project which is investigating a novel technology for separating the protein from carbohydrates from the lipids and the fiber, and then 4 products that have their own place in plant-based and cell cultured meat projects with other companies.
Great, thank you all. I think the probably most logical place to start is just to kind of back up and think about why we should be advancing the market for seaweed generally. What are the environmental benefits to increased seaweed cultivation, and what other benefits might exist from the growing industry. So I will turn this one to Dr. Levine first, and then if anyone else wants to follow up with additional answers, feel free to jump in.
Well, in terms of ecological services that growing seaweeds have to offer, both more on the localized front, certainly you've heard about acidification mitigation and nutrient remediation. So seaweeds have a lot to offer local environments. To date, most of the seaweed farming is inshore, but with the recent push by ARPA-E and the Department of Energy to go offshore, some of those benefits may be minimized. But in terms of creating global economic development from seaweed, when it started in the 70s, we really didn't have any commercial seaweed farming except for the traditional porphyra in Japan and Korea. But we're talking about now 55,000 seaweed farmers around the world. So as an economic development engine, certainly seaweed farming has been successful. And now it's on the cusp of a renaissance in terms of the industrialization of seaweed farming. And that may have great potential, and it may have also some shortcomings. That's to be determined.
Awesome. And maybe we can also hear kind of a follow-up on that from Dr. Reddy with the kind of global landscape and also how things have developed in India as well.
Yeah, well, definitely markets play a very critical role. So one of the things is that meeting the existing markets, and the other is the creating new markets. So what we are discussing today is the protein, which requires a new market. Obviously, the markets creation without which production cannot, I think, take a traction. So it is very important that the markets need to be created. One is to meet the existing market demands and gradually develop the new demands. So in India, seaweeds really not being put to any human consumption. So we have been using seaweeds only for the production of phycocolloids. So this is the first time where we are now moving from phycocolloid consumption to the human requirements. So we are trying to look at all options available with us, that we are covering our cultivation activities in the sea, at the same time even the land-based system. For proteins are concerned, we are looking at in a different strategy to grow them in a more safe and regulated manner, so the biomass produced is of quality and meets the market demands. So this is something which is very important, and definitely we need to work, need to synchronize the production with the market. That is what my views on the market development. And certainly the ecological benefits, when you are talking about it, there are direct benefits, there are indirect benefits. The direct benefits are, kind of a carbon sequestration is the one of the thing what we can see it, and the inorganic nutrients that go into the sea is another major. And the third thing in India, very important, is the employment generation. So Government of India has really come up in a very big way to allot special grant for promoting the seaweed cultivation as a part of the blue economy. So to generate a new income for the coastal people, and at the same time, I think engage people and provide alternative employment to the people as well. So I made some kind of estimates where I think 1 hectare of seaweed cultivation approximately can sequester roughly, I think around 70 approximately around 70 tons of CO2, and also 1.2 ton of nitrogen and 0.1 to 2 ton of phosphorus. So this is very important. And the another indirect, I think benefits of seaweed is that making a materials which can substitute the hydrocarbons, so that we can also, I think, indirectly help to reduce or contain the emissions, carbon CO2 emissions, because India also is signatory to the Paris Agreement. So we require to contain the CO2 emission by making an alternative green materials. And if that material can come from the sea, because the sea has a huge arable space. Okay, so that is one important thing. And another, in the farming, when we are talking about employment, 1 hectare of farming can provide roughly employment to the 15 people, and downstream industry can give another 30 people. So you can so 45 people can be employed. So if it is going to be 100 I think hectares, imagine the number of people employed. It's a phenomenon. So India is very much looking at focusing on this marine front to tap the marine resources for the economic prosperity and environmental friendly technologies.
Thank you. Very helpful. I think that it makes sense to kind of follow those comments with sort of a discussion of the advantages in the alternative protein space. So Beth, what do you see as the benefits to alternative protein producers using seaweed ingredients, both for alternative seafood, but other alternative proteins as well?
So great question. I think there's a number of aspects of functional properties that seaweeds provide great advantages for in plant-based meat and seafood. And so, just to name those real fast, the first one is texture. Traditionally, seaweed hydrocolloids, so carrageenan and agar from red seaweeds and alginate from brown seaweeds like kelp, have been used extensively in the food industry to enhance the mechanical and sensory properties of meats, processed meats, and dairy. And so those same properties are going to play a large role and have a lot of benefit for people developing new formulas for plant-based meats and dairies. There's a great water holding capacity, which those gels provide. So juiciness is an aspect that is really important for sensory characteristics, and then finally umami, which is something that we're really focused on with the protein side. The word umami was first coined by a Japanese scientist describing the unique taste of kombu or kelp, and so those things are on the functional side. Advantages that seaweed can provide to a lot of different food applications, and I think there's a large opportunity to expand the variety of like chemical and mechanical advantages of seaweed beyond just their traditional applications.
Great. And then maybe Michelle, if you don't mind following that up with kind of the applications for alternative seafood specifically, and why New Wave has kind of prioritized the use of aquatic plants in your products.
Sure, absolutely. I mean, a lot of it echoes what Beth just talked about, because we were really focused on how do we get this texture of shrimp right, because it has an initial bite, it's got this succulent chew, and that's very different than fin fish or beef and some of these other meats and seafoods that are out there. And one of the foundations is for our texture, as Beth mentioned, is alginate. And the core of our work has really revolved around how we can manipulate it to recreate those bouncy, snappy, juicy textures. And as Beth mentioned, alginate and some of these other ingredients have been in our system for a while, but I would argue they're underutilized, especially given all the benefits there are to cultivating seaweed, which other folks on this call have mentioned as well. And in addition to, especially for seaweed, there's an interesting part about flavor for us, because when we were developing the flavor for shrimp, there's a lot of compounds and things out there that we can use to get the savory, the umami, the briny flavors. But whenever we were eating shrimp and trying to describe the flavor of shrimp, there was like this fresh ocean taste that there wasn't a word for, but we're like, hey, this is within seaweed. So we actually spent time boiling kombu, boiling other stuff to try to figure out what that taste was. So that helped us guide the direction of our flavor development really well. And I think one of the opportunities is to actually look at seaweed for those flavor components as we think about alternative proteins.
Wonderful, thank you. So we have kind of, set up this sort of two worlds of sort of growing seaweed and the benefits sort of that on its own, both ecologically and economically, and some of the great functional applications of these ingredients. So I would love to turn now to kind of the bridge between those, which is kind of the processing side and turning the raw ingredients into something that, someone like an alternative protein company could use. So maybe we'll start with Charlie and then turn to Paul and just hear a little bit about sort of what kind of technology we need to really get, something that's harvested to something that's an ingredient, and where kind of the landscape for that processing technology is right now, and what kind of exciting developments do you see happening in addition to your own work?
Thanks. Yeah. So Oceanium sits very firmly in the middle of this value chain, and we kind of see ourselves as enablers of the value chain. We have a huge amount of demand from the market side. We get incoming every day from people who want ingredients, from very big companies like Nestle and Danone and the rest, down to little niche companies. So there definitely is a huge interest, and that's driven by consumer demand. But the problem is, where do you get the ingredients? We don't need seaweed, so you need the extracted ingredients. On the other side, there's a huge amount of pioneering seaweed farmers around the world, lots in Europe, particularly places like Norway, which is a real hotspot, but the rest of Europe is catching up, and of course North America, where we have contacts too. And so it's really connecting that supply side with the demand and the need for processed products. It's not for whole seaweed. There's a small market for that, but it's not enough. And that to really connect that up. And that's where bioprocessing comes in, and biorefining. So we're providing that with our approach. So we're using the whole plant, extracting all the value, making a range of products, including protein, to address the demand. And I think that role is key if this is going to grow and scale, is to have that processing capacity around the world. That's our vision, to be wherever there's farm seaweed and supply those products into the local market, to avoid food miles as well. So that's a really important role. And there's other companies emerging in Europe and North America, looking at this biorefinery approach. And really, I think it's key to unlocking seaweed for the Western Hemisphere, which is different to seaweed in Asia, where it's largely for the plate.
Thank you. And Paul, any sort of additional comments on that question as well?
I'd echo what Charles was saying, that that there are a number of companies, and there doesn't have to be one that would stand out, but rather a number that would work arguably together. But when you think of Europe, from Portugal all the way up to the Faroe Islands, there are Seaweed Farmers, and so in each spot you're going to have a processor. And the thing about seaweed farming, typically, well, so where we are on the west coast of Ireland, we put the seeded string in the water in October, and we cultivate it in late April or early May. And that's the point when we need a large facility. And so actually we need to go beyond seaweed and work with other companies that want to use a bioprocessor of that size at different times of the year. And so where other people are harvesting early summer, midsummer, and late summer of different products, they could be protein extracts as well. And I think that's where the future lies. And again, it won't, I don't believe it'll be just one company, but a number of companies that will do it.
Great. So something that's definitely been coming up is kind of the variation geographically in sort of, both from the seasonality that you were just mentioning, but also to, the varying sort of consumer appetites for seaweed products around the world. So maybe we can start with Dr. Levine on this and just kind of situate where the US is relative to other areas, and where you might see kind of the biggest growth potential for specifically the sort of sustainable and most responsible seaweed cultivation around the world.
That's a very good question. See, one merit what we enjoy is the cost of production of seaweeds in India is very competitive, right? And what we are focusing today is that one is that growing a seaweed. We are focusing more on growing a seaweed called vulva, right? And so we have proof of concept established for extracting and recovering the protein, and we also confirm the suitability for human consumption, hydrolyzing it. So what we are looking at is that we are looking at microalgae, which has a protein more than 50 to 60%, whereas seaweeds do not have that kind of a protein. So we wanted to see how can we match the macroalgae with even microalgae in terms of protein is concerned. Maybe we may have to look at a new type of cultivations and understand what promotes the protein I think accumulation and quality protein. That is one aspect of it. And second aspect, what we are looking at is today we are looking only simply protein as alternative to the meat protein, but we are trying to look one step further. Can we go for these hydrolyzed proteins where the bioavailability of the protein or even the value of the protein is much better than the crude protein and all. No? And also we are looking into the anti-nutritional factors of even protein, not simply protein. So these are the certain things which we are looking at, and we are focusing more on vulva because it's a climate resilient strain it is. So that is what we are looking at it. Maybe in a couple of years, we may be in a better off, and definitely there is a scope for looking at overseas markets. So definitely one of the answer is the biorefinery biomass. At the same time, it can be very cost effective as well.
Thank you. And anything from you, Dr. Levine, on that as well?
Well, the first thing to start off, the verbiage isn't really tight enough, because when you say the word seaweed farming, it's like saying the word agriculture. It's way too broad. And so if you're going to have a discussion, let's be precise. So you have dichotomies in all of these aspects: inshore versus offshore, traditional versus perhaps more modern techniques, individuals versus village cooperatives versus sole companies versus industrialization. Then you have the commercial reds versus the browns. They're very different organisms with very different profiles, not only in protein concentrations, but also in the value of the amino acid contents. So again, in terms of having a dialogue that's meaningful, one really has to start defining what they're talking about and getting away from just the term seaweed farming, because it's too broad. It's just too broad for anyone in the audience to get their hands around, how is it applicable to themselves. So we've heard in the chat room, people from Germany, people from India, and now India is a great potential. I've spent quite a bit of time there. I've worked with Dr. Reddy and some of the other really spectacular seaweed people in India. And the coastline itself represents a tremendous opportunity, but it's a very different opportunity than in North America. I mean, in Alaska, they're looking at 1,000-acre kelp farm. That's a very different opportunity, and the proteins are very, very different. So happy to answer any specific questions, but if we start with common terminology or common understanding of what it really means versus just saying, I'm an algae farmer, that's just like saying I'm a farmer. But the next question is it strawberries? Is it watermelon? Is it wheat? Is it cows? Is it milk? So I think that's a good starting point for everyone to truly be able to put their arms around.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think the broad sort of concept of seaweed farming gets used as kind of a monolith in a lot of different settings, and in sort of making the case for growing the industry. It's often kind of lumped together, but obviously in the same way as agriculture can be, we can have sort of the best and worst practices along a spectrum. So I actually think this would be a really interesting point for you to make, Dr. Levine, is sort of what would be kind of the ideal setting for a sort of global and maybe, picking one or two species just as an example, as a kind of a global sort of seaweed industry, a supply chain. What kind of sort of scale of production, onshore, offshore, in what kind of production processes do you think would be kind of the ideal way for the industry to shape and to kind of create something of value? And maybe that's still too broad a question, but would love to hear.
You make good points. You have traditional value chain, which is not vertically integrated, and it's mature, perhaps $8 to $12 billion a year in terms of, you have the ecumoids and the phycocolloid industry. That's not going to change. You have the Chinese kelp industry, which is 90+% of the world's production. That's not going to change. What is going to change is both spreading the let's say the community farming concept inshore. That's proved very valuable over the last 50 years, started by Max Doty out of Hawaii and funded by the United Nations as a commercial, or actually an economic development engine. But the new thing, the emergence of both the renaissance of, let's say, kelp farming in Europe and North America, right now that's being done by entrepreneurs. But the gigaton scale, and which is what the Department of Energy is interested in, the gigaton scale of algae farming has to go offshore, because the number one issue in North America will be water use conflict. It's not talked about very much. It's not understood very much. But just to give you an example, back in the 90s when we farmed, we had 123 acres and we had to arm our boats. So literally with rifles, and have people on the shore with spotlights and guns to protect our farm from urchin and scallop fishermen. So these are things you don't learn in textbooks. In fact, we wrote a textbook with one of India's premier seaweed farmer or seaweed professors, and it's not in that book. It doesn't talk about water use conflict. So those are big areas where perhaps offshore would alleviate some of that pressure. So in terms of sustainability, again, almost no one dislikes seaweed farming in terms of environmental pressure. But with industrialization, that brings a whole plethora of other potentialities that we haven't really explored.
Thank you. Really fascinating. Wish that we had hours for this session, but Paul, just wanted to give you a chance to comment on any of that, or add any color from your perspective on sort of how things scale over time in a way that makes sense.
Yeah, thanks, Jen. And great points made, Dr. Levine. I'm on a coalition, Seaweed for Europe, and we're discussing how do we go offshore. And so up until now in Europe, well, if the obvious example is in Norway, where you put a seaweed farm in a fjord. In Ireland, you might hide behind an island to hide from the southwesterlies, but actually to scale it up, we need to go outside. You call it exposed site cultivation. And that takes a lot of investment. And at that point, you're doing it at scale. Both of them married together, you need to take on a lot of investment to grow large volumes. But then you run into fishing channels and other areas like that, and it'll be about licensing those exposed sites. And I haven't seen it happening in Ireland yet, and I don't know when it will come across Europe, but that's where we need to go to, in my opinion. So.
Thank you. We have a lot of fascinating questions in the Q&A right now, and since we are getting to kind of the latter half of our time, I want to make sure that we at least get to a few of them. One that I wanted to start out with is aimed at Charlie, and that one is, can you shed some light on the ability to use seaweed for different products? So production of packaging, fertilizer, et cetera. Is this performed via various processes, or is it one integrated process allowing for kind of a zero waste model?
Sure, thanks, Jen. Thanks for the question. So if you look at the composition of seaweed, that's really well known. We've known what seaweeds are made of for a long, long time, and so you can go away with a even basic chemistry and work out what's available to you. So at the moment, for example, we're working mostly with kelps, and you have a lot of polymers. So alginate's been talked about. You have cellulose. You have some other soluble polysaccharides, which are nutraceutical. You have some protein, and you have some fatty acids. And a lot of minerals. So that's your basic palette that's available to you. And for a biorefinery to work, for the economics of seaweed, of farm seaweed production to work, you have to make value from all of that. Farm seaweed is expensive. It's more expensive than wild. We're happy to pay that because of the good it does, but that's always a given. So you have to use everything that's available. With that palette from the polymers, you can make either foodstuffs or you can make packaging. So the packaging products that are in development by us and other people primarily are based on alginate. So you're using the alginate polymer as your material that you can then convert into a film or a board or a cup or a straw. There's lots of examples around the world. So fundamentally, it's fairly simple in that you're using a natural polymer and using its properties to make a material. And then you're left with everything else, and they're fundamentally foodstuffs. You can argue about cellulose; it's a fiber. We also use the cellulose as an ingredient for our packaging to add strength. And you then have your foodstuffs, so your protein and your nutraceutical products, your fucoidan and beta-glucan. And of course, there's lots of minerals. A third of your seaweed mass when browns is minerals. Let's not forget about those. Minerals are valuable, minerals are nutritionally useful, so we should look to valorize those as well. And when you look at all of that, you arrive at a cascade biorefinery system. There's lots of examples of cascade biorefineries. Dr. Reddy's done a lot of early work on this. And you can basically, like any refinery, you split the material into its components and purify out and make a number of products which end up as dry ingredients that people can formulate with. Hopefully that covers it. And the approach is broadly similar with greens and reds. You have a different palette of potential products, but fundamentally it's the same approach. It's about splitting your material up in a commercially viable way. So this is not academic research. This is using industrial processes which are scalable, because as we've said, this needs to be at scale, and we need to be thinking in the hundreds of thousands and millions of tons, as we've said already.
Great, thank you. We just got a question that I think balances my earlier question to Beth about sort of the biggest opportunities of extracting protein from seaweeds. So maybe I'll turn this one back to Beth, which is just what are the biggest challenges? And maybe I can add, what are you working on in your research to help kind of get around them?
Yeah, great question. So I think there's a number of things, and so I'll sort of start with the beginning of the supply chain and work through. So one is sort of consistent quality and composition. Like most crops, seaweed will vary depending on environmental conditions in terms of its composition, things important to consumers like taste. And it's in a less controlled environment, the ocean harvested seaweeds, and so the quality control is something that is, I think, probably more challenging than in other industries that have a more tightly regulated and controlled farming system. So that's one aspect. The next aspect is the separation process is different than separating proteins from legumes like soy and pea. The hydrocolloids that we're separating the proteins from are actually often added to foods to stabilize the proteins. So they like to be together, and so we have to develop new processes to do that fractionation. The good news that Charlie was just touching on is that both of those fractions, unlike when you separate pea protein, you're left with residual starch, which is generally very low value, and there are not a lot of applications for it. With seaweed, you have high value in all the fractions, which I think is really promising for the economics of large scale fractionation. On the other hand, aside from just the standard processes for alginate, carrageenan, and agar, which are well established by large chemical companies, we're going to need these new models of chemistry and separation technologies to be able to extract the proteins and preserve those while also preserving the functional properties of the hydrocolloids and vitamins and minerals and bioactive compounds that have really amazing properties and are very under those aspects. The bioactives as well as the proteins are really very little understood compared to the other proteins that are commonly in our foods. And I saw someone asked a question about the digestibility. Those hydrocolloids are generally not digestible, so they can interfere with the digestion of the proteins. So, depending on the application, we're interested in separating out the proteins so that they are more digestible and easily accessible. And what we've seen from the data that we've gathered and that's been published, it's very high. The last number that we got was 97% digestibility for seaweed proteins.
Wow, great. And Michelle, I'm wondering if there have been any specific challenges with New Wave in using these ingredients and how you've overcome them as well.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So when we screen, especially for proteins or any other ingredient in our product, we have kind of three key criteria. One, it has to be light in color, like we're making shrimp, so it has to be white. I don't think people are ready for different colored shrimp at this point. And that's even a challenge when we look at row crops too, because they tend to be tan or brownish in color. The next is flavor. So we want to work with something that has a pretty neutral flavor palette. Seaweed proteins are interesting because they do have some, again, ocean characteristics that actually might work in a seaweed alternative, but might not work as well in a meat alternative. But for the most part, it's better if we have sort of a blank palette to work from our ingredients. And then the last is functionality. So we have a system that we have built. So anything that we bring in has to work with the rest of our system and the textures that we have built. I had the opportunity to look at a few years ago some seaweed proteins, and they worked really well on our product, had a really clean flavor, some kind of ocean characteristics, but they were neon yellow. So we weren't able to bring those into our product. So with the folks on the phone here today, we currently don't use seaweed protein in the product. Like I said, we use alginate for the texture and the functionality and through our flavor development. But what I'm really excited for is how we can eventually get a new wave shrimp that's completely made from seaweed or microalgae. I think there's a lot of opportunity for microalgae as well, because I think it's a wonderful way for products like ours that are inspired by the ocean to bring them back to the ocean by actually using ingredients that are from our seas or aquaculture.
Excellent. And since you mentioned microalgae, I wonder if you could expand on that a bit, since we got a question asking about kind of the relative benefits of the micro and macroalgae spaces.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, what I can tell you about microalgae is I've looked at it from the nutritive oils, so omega fatty acids that a lot of microalgae can provide. It's interesting with shrimp, they don't have omega 3s like tuna and salmon and other products have, but there's microalgae farming that can produce these omega fatty acids that we can bring into our product, and then we can start thinking about shrimp of the nutrition of our product is, okay, what does maybe better than shrimp look like if we can bring in some of these products. So
awesome. Thank you. I think that I'm not sure who wants to take this one, but I will maybe turn it to Paul first and then let anyone else jump in. I think it's a really interesting question, which is about ocean pollution. So the asker is wondering if there are issues with ocean pollution, for example, mercury and microplastics with seaweed farming. They know people who no longer use sea salt and use mined salt instead due to worries about ocean pollution, and don't know if rejecting salt due to pollution is sensible, but do know that there are concerns with people about sort of ocean pollution and dietary preferences as it relates. So I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, my thoughts are we all need to be concerned about ocean pollution. I think people should be concerned about what they're putting in. The water sources, we're fortunate on the west coast of Ireland. Typically in certain areas it's grade A waters, and so very suitable for aquaculture, and companies have been culturing mussels and many other species for a long time, and so I think also the panelists on here would be working in areas that are clean. You typically don't get a license when the area isn't clean, and we always test our materials that we produce for heavy metals and then also for bacterias and things like that, and so yeah, ocean pollution is a major concern, particularly as the population grows. I think education would be a factor there. Microplastics, yes, they're there in minute numbers. Let's try and stop those. But I think it's a longer discussion than just this one.
Yeah, maybe I could come in there, Jen, as well. I think that's another point of taking a biorefinery approach. You've really got an opportunity there to eliminate pollution, and we see that clearly in all the work we've done. That the simple chemistry of a biorefinery allows you to take out those things, including microplastics. So that's a real strength for making these processed products.
Wonderful. And I saw a question about the biorefinery technology that I'm wondering if you have an answer to, which is just about other uses for the bioreactors, since seaweed cultivation is seasonal.
A great question, and that really kind of mirrors our thinking so much. So we're going to be on coastal locations near seaweed farms around the world, and we're probably going to have seaweed for 3 to 6 months of the year, depending the location and the harvest season. So that's a big issue for a company when you think about the capital expenditure for a factory. So we are always looking for ways to fill out the season, and in some locations, it may be that we work alongside a fishing industry that has a different season, so we can share facilities, share process operators, and really maximize the use of a facility, which is great for commercial and environmental reasons. So that's one approach. The other approach is to look at multi-species farming. So if there's an opportunity for different colors of seaweed with different harvest seasons, or in some locations, people are harvesting multiple times. So in the Faroes, for example, ocean rainforest done very well, and they coppice and they harvest 3 times a year. So you get a supply of seaweed for a much longer part of the year. All of those are great approaches, and I think long term, when we're at large scale, it'll be common that seaweed is available, especially with offshore farming. Seaweed is available for a much longer season, from the spring right through to the autumn, which is currently only available in very few locations.
Wonderful, thank you. I think we have time for 1 or 2 more questions before I want to give folks a break before those who want to join the networking session. So I think this is a fascinating question, and I want to turn it to Beth, which is just, can you talk about the biofuels applications and tropic's role in this? And what I find really interesting about this question is the second part, which is, how do you balance the energy and alternative protein applications?
Yeah, so I didn't have time to mention in my intro, but my background is in biofuels. That's how I first got into seaweed. I was an early employee of the company Bioarchitecture Lab, which was developing a synthetic biology fermentation platform for converting alginate into bioethanol. Biofuels is a really tough business because fuels is all about economies of scale, huge economies of scale. And so while the technology and the potential for seaweeds to be a feedstock for biofuels is great from just a physical and chemical standpoint, it really comes down to economics, and it comes down to with fuels, it's all about the cost of the feedstock, which is why the Department of Energy is investing in technologies to increase the scale and efficiency of large-scale seaweed farming, because right now the industry is mostly done by smallholders, using that don't have the ability to invest in capital infrastructure for large-scale farming. So we're really excited about the technology that we're developing in that, and I'm happy to talk about that in the next session. But I think it's all about economics. One of the things we're excited about is that you can separate the protein and then take the remaining carbohydrates. You would first go towards the higher value applications, which is the hydrocolloids and food. But at very large scale, you could then also provide that carbohydrate stream to a fermentation platform to make any type of higher value hydrocarbon for fuels. So I think that's not in our immediate future, but it's certainly the sort of ultimate end goal of scalable seaweed farming.
Thank you.
I just like to add some point to what I think she was talking.
Sure.
So the alternative way of looking at making fuel from algal sources, so definitely recovering the protein, and the carbon what is available can be taken as a oleaginous yeast roots to make biodiesel. So that might work more positively than converting, hydrolyzing the carbohydrate into ethanol route and all. So we look at it using the carbon, the polysaccharide is a carbon source too, and take the oleaginous route, and from the oleaginous yeast you can make biodiesel or aviation fuel. So there is one thing which we are looking at it. At this point of time, we are not working on it, but if we have to work on the biofuel production, we would like to take a different route. We don't want to take pyrolysis and the hydrolysis and fermentation, because they're all energy intensive. When we do ROE, so we have to see that whether the returns of energy is more than what you spent it. So we are looking at the oleaginous yeast route.
Thank you. I wish that we could continue this conversation all day, but we are at time, and I want to respect folks' time and give them a few minutes to take a break before we move on to the networking session. So huge thank you to all 6 panelists for bringing your different perspectives to this conversation. It's fascinating sort of development of a market at the same time as the alternative protein industry is growing, and hope to see many of you over in the networking session. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.